Power is often measured in what can be seen: gold, land, armies, structures that signal dominance in visible ways. But the most effective forms of power are rarely visible at all, because what truly defines control is not what a leader possesses, but what others are allowed to possess. That distinction changes everything, because ownership creates independence, and independence creates options, and options, when they exist outside central authority, create risk. This is the part of power that is often misunderstood, because most systems are built around accumulation: more resources, more influence, more reach. The assumption is simple: the more you have, the stronger you become. And at a surface level, that is true, but only under one condition: that others do not gain enough to challenge your position. Because wealth does not exist in isolation. It spreads, it moves, it creates networks. It allows individuals to operate beyond the control of the system that produced it. And once that happens, power begins to decentralize. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. And gradually is enough, because over time, distributed strength becomes harder to manage, harder to predict, harder to contain. That is the moment where some leaders begin to see the system differently, not as something to expand endlessly, but as something to regulate carefully, to shape, to limit, to control at its source. Because if you can control the flow of wealth, you can control the structure of power itself. This is where the strategy begins, not in open conquest, not in visible domination, but in quiet restriction, in deciding who can access resources, who can trade, who can accumulate, and more importantly, who cannot. At first, these decisions appear administrative: small adjustments, policy shifts, controlled permissions. But over time, they create a pattern, a structure where access is no longer equal, where opportunity is not freely available, where movement within the system depends on approval, and approval depends on proximity to power. This is how dependence is created, not through force, but through limitation. Because when individuals cannot operate independently, they must operate within the system. And when they operate within the system, they become easier to manage, easier to influence, easier to align. This creates a form of stability, a controlled environment where variables are reduced, where unpredictability is minimized, where outcomes become more consistent. And consistency in systems of power is highly valued, because it allows for planning, for expansion, for the maintenance of order. But stability has a cost, and that cost is flexibility, because the same restrictions that prevent disruption also prevent growth. The same controls that limit risk limit innovation. The same system that ensures dependence reduces initiative. And at first, this is not a problem, because the system still functions. It still produces results. It still maintains its structure. But over time, the effects begin to accumulate, slowly, quietly, in ways that are not immediately obvious. Because systems do not fail when they stop working. They fail when they stop improving. And improvement requires freedom. The freedom to experiment, to explore, to operate outside strict boundaries. But in a controlled system, those freedoms are reduced. And without them, progress slows, not to a halt, but enough to create a difference, a gap between what is and what could be. That gap is where tension begins, because some within the system begin to notice. They recognize the limitations. They see what is possible, but not allowed. And that awareness creates pressure, not visible rebellion, but internal resistance, a subtle shift in how individuals engage with the system. Less initiative, less creativity, less willingness to go beyond what is required. And that changes the nature of the system itself, because a system is only as dynamic as the people within it. And when those people become constrained, the system reflects that constraint. It becomes predictable, stable, controlled, but also slower, less responsive, less capable of adapting to change. And change is constant. It comes from outside, from other systems, other regions, other structures that operate under different conditions. Some more open, some more flexible, some less controlled. And those systems begin to evolve in ways that this one cannot. Not because they are stronger, but because they are less restricted. Because they allow movement, variation, adaptation. And over time, that difference becomes significant. Because adaptability is what determines long-term survival. Not control, not stability, but the ability to adjust when conditions change. And when a system is built on control, adjustment becomes difficult, because every change affects the structure. Every shift requires permission. Every adaptation must pass through layers of authority, and that slows everything down. At first, the system compensates. It relies on its existing strength, its established position, its accumulated power. But those are static advantages. They do not evolve on their own. And without evolution, they begin to lose relevance. Not immediately, but gradually, as other systems continue to move forward. This is where the paradox becomes clear. The very strategy that created control now limits growth. The very system that ensured stability now resists change. And the very structure that protected power now isolates it, because power that is too centralized becomes dependent on itself. It cannot distribute responsibility. It cannot adapt quickly. It cannot respond to new conditions efficiently. And that creates vulnerability, not through weakness, but through rigidity. Because rigidity in a changing environment is a form of weakness, even if the system appears strong, even if it remains stable, even if it continues to function. Because function is not enough, not over time. What matters is alignment. Alignment with reality, with changing conditions, with new dynamics. And when alignment is lost, systems begin to drift, not collapse immediately, but move away from effectiveness. And once that movement begins, it becomes harder to reverse, because the system is not designed for rapid change. It is designed for control, for consistency, for stability. And those qualities, while valuable, are not sufficient in isolation. They must be balanced with flexibility, with openness, with the ability to evolve. And when that balance is missing, the system reaches its limit, not because it fails dramatically, but because it can no longer keep up, because it cannot move fast enough, because it cannot adjust effectively, because it cannot release the control it depends on. That is the final stage. Not collapse, but constraint. A system that continues to exist, but no longer leads, no longer shapes the environment, no longer defines the future, because it is too focused on preserving the present. And preservation, without adaptation, is not sustainable. That is the deeper lesson. Power is not just about control. It is about balance. The balance between structure and flexibility, between authority and freedom, between stability and change. And when that balance is lost, even the most powerful systems reach a point where control is no longer